session, and Sim, you're going to post it on your YouTube channel.
That's
correct?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so hopefully that is okay with everybody. So today we're officially launching Sim Currents Depart, and we're talking about reading and writing climate fiction in a climate emergency. And my name is Selena Middleton. I am publisher and editor-in-chief at Stelliform Press, which is a new press out of Hamilton, Canada. We're publishing genre, literary, and nonfiction books related to climate change and relationships with our environments. And Sim Currents Depart is our first book. Yay! All right, so before we begin, I just want to do a land acknowledgement. To acknowledge the land that both our author and publisher are located on. Currently, Texas is stewarded by the Alabama Coushatta and the Kickapoo traditional tribes of Texas, the Isleta del Sur Pueblo, the Lipan Apache tribe, and the Texas Band of Yaqui Indians. Historically, Houston was the territory of the Karankawa, who suffered genocide at the hands of Texan colonists, and the Atakapa Ishak, who are currently seeking recognized status. Now, as countries around the world, and especially rich Western nations, become more insular in response to climate change and its continual crises, we must recognize the violence of borders to people and wildlife. The imposed border between Texas and Mexico creates a barrier for Indigenous people who have family members residing in both places. The border severs Indigenous communities and the ecosystems of the borderlands as Trump builds the wall between the US and Mexico. So wherever you are, I encourage you to look into the history of the land that you live on, to look up the agreements or treaties between governments and Indigenous people, and familiarize yourself with your responsibilities to the land and its first stewards as part of an equitable response to climate change. Another act of environmental justice is to acknowledge the labor of Black people in both the US and Canada. Black labor shaped these lands, but Black folks have historically been denied the rights to work lands for their own communities. Environmental justice includes support for reparations and Black Lives Matter. Now here in Hamilton, Canada, Stelliform Press is on the traditional territory shared between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nations, which was acknowledged in the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Agreement. The wampum uses the symbols of a dish to represent the territory, and one spoon to represent that the people are to share the resources of the land and only take what they need. This image represents an ethic that we need now and in the future. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce our author, Sim Kern. Sim Kern is a speculative fiction author writing at intersections of queerness, social justice, and climate change. Their debut novella, Depart, is now out from Stelliform Press. Originally from Illinois, Sim has called Houston home since 2007 and spent 10 years teaching English in Houston schools before focusing on writing. They live along the Brays Bayou with their toddler, husband, and a very good dog. Okay, so I will pass the mic over to Sim for reading from Depart.
Thanks, Selena. And we could hear you really good. So thank you for that introduction and land acknowledgement. So I'm going to start reading from a little bit further. If you've joined me on my YouTube channel, I read the first chapter there, and then I read the next little part at my last author event with Brazos Bookstore. And today I'm going to be picking up with a chapter. So Noah, our main character, he's a Jewish trans guy. He's just left Houston. There's been a devastating hurricane and flood. And he's found himself in the Dallas Mavericks basketball arena, which has been turned into a shelter for climate refugees. He sort of found a group of other queer people to hang out with. They have a group of cots together. And this chapter comes with sort of his first chance to like catch his breath. He's got his laptop out and he's kind of looking at the news and trying to piece together what happens. Something else that you'll hear him referencing is Abe, who's the ghost of his great grandfather who's haunting him. And he keeps seeing visions of this little boy, and the boy has saved his life a couple times, saved his life during the storm, and he's kind of pieced together the clues to figure out that this little boy he's seeing is his great grandfather who fled Nazi Germany during the Holocaust. So you'll hear some mentions of Abe as well. So he's on his laptop, he's like gotten a chance at the charging strip to like have a moment to rest, and like he's checking on his friends. He's not seeing that they've checked into Facebook. He's emailing his parents. He hasn't seen them online either. Next, he checks the news, but the anchor is standing in front of a hologram of the Addicts Dam, explaining that Houston was a city scooped out of mucky coastal prairie. Its dry land artificially maintained by a network of concrete bayous and two massive dams to the west, the Addicts and Barker. The Addicts Dam had held 200 million cubic meters of water back from the city until Martha had overfilled it and its walls had crumbled. The ticker at the newscaster's feet reads, "Dam collapse, death toll estimated in the hundreds of thousands." Panic claws up his throat and he slams the laptop shut. The other people gathered around the tangle of power strips are all on the phone with insurance companies or assuring relatives that they're doing fine, but Noah has no one to call. He's not a homeowner and his friends and family are probably, but he doesn't want to think about that. So he turns his mind to Abe instead, wondering what these visions might mean. Noah majored in psychology in college, and he has a hunch Abe is some kind of stress-induced hallucination. The diagnosis is not comforting because these symptoms could indicate the onset of schizophrenia, which tends to manifest at Noah's age. So far, Abe seems to be a survival mechanism, a manifestation of Noah's fears and gut instincts, and he has served Noah well. But there's no telling if these visions will subside with the floodwaters or mark the onset of a lifetime of delusion. Noah was raised in a family of proud atheists, so he doesn't let himself seriously consider alternative explanations. Earlier in the bathroom, when he tried to talk to Abe aloud, that was simply a moment of panic brought on by gender dysphoria and stress. There's no such thing as God or ghosts, no life after death. When Noah gets back to the cots, he spots new faces. Malone met some queer college kids in the food line, and they've moved their stuff nearby. After everyone introduces themselves and their pronouns, Elena jokes that their part of the arena should be called Montrose Dos, after Houston's queer neighborhood, and they all laugh. "I was in Montrose, when the dam broke," Noah says. Everyone falls silent. Instantly, he regrets saying anything, spoiling the moment. "How?" Malone mouths, eyes wide. "They mean, how did you live to tell about it? Everyone's seen the footage, the wall of water that claims every neighborhood from the Beltway to downtown. You know those apartments at Studemont and Allen Parkway? I was in my car on top of the parking garage." They wait for him to say more. He looks down at the cot because it's easier than meeting their eyes. It wasn't like it looks on TV. There wasn't this huge wave or anything. From the top of the garage, I could see Buffalo Bayou, and it was out of its banks already, but it always does that in a bad storm. And then all of a sudden, it started coming up. He lifts his hand to show the speed of the rise. You know how the old Party Boy warehouse is right there? I watched the water go up the side of the building, 1 story, 2 stories. On top of the parking garage, there was like this little shed, or I guess it was the entrance to the stairwell. The roof there was a little higher than the cars, and I got a feeling that I had to get up there." He doesn't share that feeling was a ghost boy banging on his rain-lashed car window, shouting, "Up the stairs." So I got out of my car and I climbed up on a truck to get on that roof, and it was just in time because then I heard this sound like, he shakes his head, searching for words, like a million rolls of thunder all at once. Then the water came up over the top of the garage and it pushed the cars. My car, where I'd been sitting a second ago, it pushed them clear off the roof like they were rubber duckies. And I could see how fast the water was moving because of all the stuff in it, parts of houses and roofs and cars. And his voice breaks and he stares down at his lap, filled with the sudden certainty that his messages to Emmerich, Max, and Sasha will remain unread. The water came up so fast, there was no way they'd gotten out in time. With terrible clarity, he sees a vision of his friends' bodies drifting through the darkened, flooded tomb of their apartment. Malone rests a hand on his back, bringing him back to the present moment. After a while, the water started going down. I guess the dam had emptied out by then. I kept hoping to see buildings or lights out where Montrose was, but it was all dark. It just rained and rained until I thought my skin was going to dissolve. I thought that was it for me, and I really don't know if it was 20 minutes or hours, but finally a helicopter came. There's a long silence. I was north of 610 where it wasn't so bad, Malone breathes. I was in Katy, Elena nods, got stuck at work, and the Cajun Navy rescued me off the roof of the Dollar Tree, but the water wasn't more than 3-4 feet deep there. She clears her throat. I had a lot of friends in Montrose. We all did, David says, voice rasping. We've had bad storms before, right? Malone says. Hurricane Harvey, Ike, and New Orleans came back from Katrina. I think this time is different, Noah says. He presses his fist to his eyes to blot his tears. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he sees swift, dark water. That's where I'm gonna stop.
Thank you, Sim. That was really great. It was a really great section to read for my first question, which is about characters in climate fiction. But before I ask it, I just want to remind everybody that, that you can ask questions in the chat, and I'll be watching that to see if anyone has any questions. So my first question is, I'm curious about your approach to climate fiction. And the section that you read was very character-based. So we met quite a few people and they're telling their personal stories about their experience with the flood. And I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about your choice to approach climate fiction through character.
Yeah, well, I mean, good fiction is character driven, right? So I think that's the role of climate fiction authors. I mean, I'm not a scholar or a scientist. I'm not the person to be writing really detailed nonfiction about what to expect with climate change, but I still think there's a societal disconnect between people who get it about climate change and people who don't. And I think there's a role of climate artists of all kinds in putting you really in the shoes of someone who's experiencing these climate effects. I mean, I think even compared to like some of my friends and family members who live in more milder climates, who are living in the Midwest or on the East Coast, I don't think they're quite experiencing it the same way people on the Gulf Coast or the West Coast with all the wildfires burning lately are experiencing it. And so I think we need to be telling these stories. And when people really connect with the character and the characters that they're reading about, then it's kind of real to them in a way that will hopefully inspire more action.
Yeah, and I think that's something that you and I talked about a little bit before, how the people who are writing climate fiction right now are the ones who are experiencing the really strong effects, the seasonal fires and hurricanes, and they're the ones who are feeling like this is an emergency, whereas others, might be slightly concerned. But it's interesting that, like, I totally agree with you that character makes good fiction. But climate fiction itself, or Cli-Fi as it's sometimes called, really didn't start out that way. So I'm thinking of, forgive me if you're a Kim Stanley Robinson fan, but I'm thinking of Kim Stanley Robinson's very technical narratives, so like terraforming or generation shift stories. So do you consider yourself working within that kind of legacy of Cli-Fi, or are you doing something different?
Well, when I think about the early Cli-Fi stories that like inspired me, a lot of them were movies. And maybe like categorized more under dystopia, right? But I'm thinking of like Tank Girl, Waterworld, Mad Max, like post-apocalyptic landscapes when there's some kind of suggestion that this was like climate based. And then of course, like Margaret Atwood is a huge influence of mine. Also writing pretty post-apocalyptic stuff with Oryx and Crake, and what's the other one? Like Flight Behavior. I think Flight Behavior is similar to what I was trying to do here in showing sort of that moment, not a post-apocalyptic story, but I think we need more like mid-apocalyptic stories. Like if you're on the West Coast this summer, it felt apocalyptic, I'm sure. Like here on the Gulf Coast, just having the last 2 months constantly under the threat of a tropical storm or hurricane coming, it feels like it's already here, right? And I think we do need more stories like of this while we're in it, while climate effects, climate change are going to be going on for the next 75 to 100 years. So we don't need to just be skipping ahead to some future wasteland, but really thinking about what are the stories that are going to emerge as the climate is deteriorating, and showing that there's still hope and there's still things to fight for, even as things are starting to unravel in terms of our climate and like human society.
So when you talk about Flight Behavior, that's Barbara Kingsolver?
That's Margaret Atwood. Barbara Kingsolver wrote like Prodigal Summer, which I kind of see as a climate novel. It's a book about humans with dysfunctional relationships with the natural environment and the deterioration of the natural environment.
Can you talk a little bit about what it was about that book in particular that really, well, you said that it was the one that influenced you to write Depart Depart.
Oh, Flight Behavior? Yeah. Flight Behavior, because it was sort of that beginning of deterioration. It's not set in a post-apocalyptic landscape, but it's starting to show much more immediate and realistic climate effects. And it's set in the Appalachian Mountains, and there's a great deal of like love and connection to the natural landscape that comes through. And it's also a book about community. Actually, Flight Behavior and Prodigal Summer are both books really talking about an entire community's interaction with the natural environment and the entire community's response to climate change. And that's something also I was trying to show with this book, is how this whole little community that forms in the climate shelter is responding to things.
Yeah, and I thought that was something that you did really well, especially since the climate shelter is really like a microcosm of what's going on outside of that particular location. And everyone in the climate shelter has undergone some sort of loss. And so to show those people really making connections and deep connections in that kind of situation, for me, reading it as your editor, I was heartened by that. Looks like we do have a question from Leslie in the chat. So she says, I really loved Sim's recent tweet about being heartened through the difficult art of climate fiction and the many interrelated issues of social justice. Can you talk about that more? How can we leverage characters in fiction to create a more sustainable world for everyone?
What a great question. Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, when I first wanted to write climate change, which my early attempts were like back in college, I was definitely thinking about climate fiction in terms of like warning people. Like, we got to warn people. We got to freak everybody out because no one's taking this seriously enough. And I still think to some extent that's really necessary. Like, obviously I wrote this book and I focused on the Addicts Dam because that's a real, I mean, there was a really well-researched like ProPublica article that inspired this book about how the Addicts Dam is just like set to fail. And it's like extremely dangerous according to the Army Corps of Engineers or whatever. And so I think that climate change, climate fiction and climate art does need to kind of paint this picture and warn people about what might be coming, increase like urgency around climate change. But like you said, I mean, I think it's also, there's these interrelated issues of social justice. And I think it's important that climate artists also, we're not just warning, we're also kind of showing people the way. When I think about one of my good friends, María-Elisa, who is one of the artists I'm featuring in the climate kit. We're both artists who think about climate change constantly. And I think in a way, climate artists can show a way, like healthier and less healthy ways to respond to what's going on. So like, we don't just abandon our friends when shit hits the fan, right? We don't, we make sure we're not perpetuating white supremacy as we address climate change. We make sure we're not creating eco-fascism when addressing climate change. I think that artists, climate-focused artists, will have a role to sort of sketch out what appropriate responses to climate change will look like, both on like the individual level, like how do you cope with your climate grief? How do you find the courage to go on? How do you build community in a climate crisis? And on like a societal level, you know, how do we make sure we're not perpetuating the injustices of the past when we're reacting to climate effects? Does that answer the question? Does that sort of make sense?
Leslie says yes, great answer.
Okay.
Sam, you mentioned this idea of climate grief, and that was one thing that really struck me about your book, is that there are layers and layers of trauma, really, that the characters have experienced, not just in their immediate lives, but in the lives of their ancestors. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and what kind of role trauma has in the ways that people respond to climate change.
Yeah, I think we need to honor our climate grief a lot more, like as individuals and on a societal level. That's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, was how this book was an attempt to deal with my own climate grief. Someone asked about like what, you know, inspired this the most. I didn't live through Katrina, but I lived through Hurricane Harvey here in Houston, and many of the experiences from the book are directly like drawn from my experiences and my friends' experiences during Hurricane Harvey, when we saw the majority of our city go underwater. And it's just, you know, every time I open Twitter, every time I look at the news, there's some headline about climate change that hits me in the gut, you know, and I've been trying to just let myself feel that. I think I've never stopped grieving for the climate, because we're all like, I'm like constantly cycling through the anger, the denial. We're like, okay, I just need to push that away and like cook dinner right now, you know. The bargaining, like, okay, well, 50,000 acres have burned, but how bad is that really? How is that compared to like a normal year? Like, maybe it's still okay. How much forest is left? Like, there's, you know, all those stages of grief. I feel them constantly, because we're watching the deterioration of the entire natural world, like on every corner of the earth. And this is something that started really bothering me when I was a teenager, and it wasn't something that was ever acceptable to talk about until very, very recently. It was just, other people either weren't feeling it, or there was like an unspoken, we don't talk about climate grief. We don't talk about it with our coworkers. We don't talk about it with our friends, really. It just, we weren't talking about it in the political arena for most of my life. And so it's kind of a recent thing that climate change has gotten so in your face and so obvious that we are starting to talk about it more in a more widespread way as a society. And I think that climate focused artists can kind of show, like, yeah, we're grieving, and it's okay to be going through these grieving emotions. And maybe even when I see pieces of climate literature, when I read climate fiction, like another one, Richard Powers' is The Overstory. Like, that book just destroyed me. It's a book about trees, and it's like a love story to trees. And you learn in incredible detail how trees are just being ruined all over the planet, right? And it's absolutely gutting. But I find it ultimately heartening, because just hearing that other people are feeling the loss of the natural world the way I am is comforting, and it's necessary. So I hope that my book does that for other people as well.
Did you find that the process of writing the book was taking you through, I don't know if I mean the stages of grief, but maybe helping you to manage that in a different way?
In some ways, it's made my anxiety a lot worse. Like during hurricane season this year, I had my own scenes, my own like disaster scenes from Depart to Part, like the one I just read, like playing in my head. Definitely informed part of my decision to evacuate ahead of Hurricane Laura, which didn't end up hitting us. I think it did. It helped me process my grief and other stuff about my gender and the Jewishness in the book, which are, other major themes. I guess that's something also that kind of ties into what you were saying earlier about character, is none of us is dealing with climate grief in a vacuum. We're dealing with climate grief alongside the rise of fascism and white supremacy, and alongside just like personal identity issues and familial relationships that are being strained by what's going on. Like, we all have 100 different things on our mind, and climate grief is really just one of them. I think that's reflected in the book.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, connecting that idea of the many different intersections of justice issues that are rising at the same time as the climate crisis. I just want to touch on this question here from Michael DeLuca. He says, I'm curious, Sim, what research you did into the experience of people displaced by flood and jammed into a sports arena. Katrina comes up in the book as an obvious predecessor. Are there stories you recommend about that disaster that you drew from for Depart to Part?
So yeah, for the research, part of it was just lived experience. I did go and read, someone has done a collecting narratives from Hurricane Harvey about what happened. I had friends, and I was part of a group of teachers who, similar to in the book, were organizing, we were organizing like daycare programs and half-day schools within the shelters in Houston, and all the major sports arenas in Houston were being used as shelters. And the same was true during Hurricane Katrina. We got a lot of refugees from New Orleans coming to Houston area sports arenas. So I read some of the accounts of that, looked back on pictures to make sure that my memory was fresh of, what it was like in those settings. In terms of like art and fiction about Katrina, like off the top of my head, I'm thinking of Beasts of the Southern Wild is a fantastic movie. It's not about Katrina, but it's about Gulf Coast hurricanes. What is it, Zaytoon? The graphic novel that I'm giving away as one of the door prizes, Holdouts, is about hurricanes affecting the Gulf Coast. That's by my friend of mine, Sarah Welch. I know I'm going to be like forgetting some, and I'm going to be mad at myself. But those are kind of places I drew my inspiration. And like I said, in terms of like sketching out the specifics of the disaster and how the collapse of one of the dams would affect Houston, I really relied on that ProPublica study that came out a while back.
There's a comment in the chat about climate grief, and I don't want to dwell on that too much, but I do want to ask you what was the hardest part of Depart for you to write, and do you, when you look back on the book in its finished state, is there any part of it that you would change or maybe revisit in a future book?
In terms of the hardest part, I remember like getting real stuck on the ending. Like I wrote 2/3 of it pretty quickly and then had a really hard time pushing through to the end. I didn't want to kind of tear away the sense of safety that had been created. I didn't want to make the shit hit the fan, as it were. I'm happy with how it turned out, Selena, especially thanks to your edits. When we went deeper into Noah's relationship with Abe as part of the resolution, I really liked that. But I knew I wanted to leave the ending ambiguous because I don't think you can like tie a pretty bow necessarily on stories about climate change. But I wanted there to be some optimism at the end there, and for our characters to have a shot.
Yeah, and I do think that it's successful in that way. We don't really know what happens at the end, but there's definitely, you've woven in some threads of hope there, and especially in terms of
I think
Noah's commitment to his community.
Yeah. The second part of the question.
How
sorry, go ahead. You asked the second part of the question.
I was just going to ask for the second part.
Yeah, what would I rewrite or change now?
Yeah.
One thing is like the effect of the pandemic. I'm sort of relieved that we finished the book and it went to press before the pandemic, because it makes it easier to not have to grapple with like how would that have affected every single one of these interactions.
Right, the pandemic in the emergency arena.
Yeah. I also remember I contacted you in May because I wanted to take a more clearly abolitionist stance against the role of police in this story. And you talked me down and were like, Simone, we're a month away from printing. And like, also the cops in your book literally turn into Nazis at one point. So like, it is not a pro-cop story. It's really clear that the cops treat the white people in the arena differently than the non-white people, that the cops are antagonistic towards the trans members of the community, and that it's the trans people of color that are facing the most scrutiny. I do think I would have made it a little more, there is sort of like a decent cop or a good cop, and you're supposed to see the hypocrisy of how she treats Noah differently than the other refugees, but I think I would have made that just a little bit more apparent if I was writing it again. Just not to be subtle about it. That was the one review, someone reviewed it on Goodreads and like read it as like, there's a good cop in this story, and that was not my intention at all. And I was like, yeah, I would have made that a little bit harsher.
I did read that cop as a potential member of the LGBTQ community that recognized Noah in some way. And I thought it was an interesting addition to the way that you diversified the LGBTQ community. You know, you showed people from different backgrounds, people with, you know, from different classes, and how it wasn't all harmony between them. And having a cop as part of that, I thought was a really good touch.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. I hope it came through. It was just maybe I'm increasingly realizing that in 2020, you can't always be subtle in your fiction. Like you don't want anyone to misinterpret you. So that's what I would.
Yeah, definitely difficult. Yeah. It reminds me of your thread on Twitter recently about, I think you were talking about your novel and how difficult it is to write dystopia these days.
Yeah. It's like you don't want to, there's so much misinformation and there's so many conspiracy theories that have like a seed of truth to them. And so when you're writing a dystopia, you're taking some like seed of truth and extrapolating it into a nightmare scenario. You know, that's the tradition of dystopian science fiction. But with so many people living that as their reality these days and with so much misinformation, it's almost got me wondering like, well, is writing dystopia responsible? Is it helpful? Or there's a million ways to misunderstand it, you know, so you have to be really careful.
Yeah. There's a question from Jennifer in the chat. So I'm curious about Abe. What were your thoughts around including some potentially paranormal or spiritual content beyond our very tangible world?
I love whimsical fiction. Like I love genre fiction. And I think stories about climate are a really sort of bitter pill to swallow. And I've always seen like the supernatural element as a way to, you know, sweeten the medicine sort of, or just have there be that whimsy that can kind of carry you through talking about some really difficult, dark stuff. And in some ways, humans like process really deep learnings best through mythology. Like mythology is I think still very useful to sort of grappling with difficult truths. So I incorporated that. It's just more fun for me to write a ghost story about a terrible tragedy than to just write a terrible tragedy.
So true. Can you talk a little bit about like how things like ghosts or spirituality, paranormal things, or even the more intangible elements of culture might, what do those things add to climate fiction, in your opinion?
Did I just answer that question? I'm not sure what you're trying to get at. Like deeper than what I just said. I'm not sure what you're asking.
I thought it was like when you were talking before, it was, I thought you were approaching it more generally.
Well, maybe I can answer it through Leslie's question.
Sure.
Which is like focusing just specifically on like how Jewishness sort of informed Noah's response to the disaster, and why include like the elements of Jewish spirituality in a book about climate change. And I think that I've just discovered personally that there's incredible comfort and value to be gained in observing like the traditions of our ancestors, even if you're an atheist, even if you're, you know, a very scientifically logical minded person, like just marking Hanukkah, Passover, or Rosh Hashanah in this very difficult year, thinking back, like those have been some of the best days of 2020 for me, or in pre-2020. And so yeah, I think that as society is spiraling away from us, there's a lot to be gained in looking to the past and preserving our traditions and sort of honoring the ways that our ancestors marked time in difficult years, and the way that our ancestors processed like getting through difficult times, you know, or grappling with our demons, like the way that our ancestors described those things might still have value in the way that Noah finds, you know, medieval historical descriptions of Dybbuk's are helpful to him in processing his ongoing climate trauma and probable PTSD, and even his transness, which I don't want to pathologize, but like him discovering that his ancestors may have explained away trans people through this idea of, you know, women becoming possessed with male spirits is like incredibly heartening to him, because it's like him seeing himself represented 500 years ago.
Yeah, I think what you were saying about mythology before comes into play here. Like the things like mythology and spirituality and traditions are the things that they're like the glue of society. And when we're living in a time when there are so many things that are pulling us apart in different ways, I think that, you know, clinging to those things makes sense. And you see that in Depart Depart as well, where Noah does find a lot of comfort in the research that he does.
Yeah.
So we are about 9 minutes away from 8 p.m. So I'll just ask one more question. And if anyone else has any questions, do drop them in the chat, because we're coming to the end of the hour. You have talked about a few climate fiction books over the course of our chat, but I was wondering if there are any more that you wanted to mention, and like, what do you like about them, and do they offer hope? Like, do you find hope in those texts?
Yeah, gosh, I think I already mentioned my biggest influences. But yeah, I would recommend definitely Richard Powers' The Overstory, which is a book about trees that everyone needs to read.
I don't know if you noticed when you subbed Depart Depart that there's a quote from The Overstory on the main page of the Stelliform site.
Oh, cool. I don't think I noticed that, but
yeah, that book destroyed me too.
Yeah, it destroyed me, but then I was like, I'm so grateful for that book. I look at trees in such a richer way than I ever did before. Like, it's amazing.
Yeah. He gives a history of the trees, and they are characters.
Talk to each other through their roots and how they help each other. And if one's getting attacked by beetles, the next tree over that's a different freaking species will release some chemical into the air that will attract the wasps that eat the beetles that are eating its friend tree. Like, that kind of knowledge about trees. There was so much scientific information packed into that book.
Yes.
Alongside the fiction and the mythology of it, that was just so amazing. Like, definitely check out The Overstory. Prodigal Summer, like I said, great book about human relations to the natural environment. I just read a book that's been labeled as Cli-Fi a lot of places. I would say it falls more under the category of like human communities' relationship with natural environment, although it's not really dealing directly with how the climate is changing. But that book was Latitudes of Longing by, what was her name? Oh my God. Swarup is the author's last name, Swarup. And that it's been on a lot of lists of Cli-Fi, and it was a really wonderful book.
Yes, that's the one that you told me to read, and it's on my list now too.
Yeah.
So it looks like we did cover the questions in the chat. Simone, before we go to the prizes, is there any last thing you wanted to say about, you know, being a writer of climate fiction and a reader? Any last messages?
I'm just really excited for other writers and authors to keep exploring climate fiction, keep supporting other artists who are doing Cli-Fi, whether it's in the visual arts, like the people I included in the prize giveaway, the climate survival kit, or whether it's writers. let's just all keep writing about it and doing it and trying to keep it the focus of the cultural conversation. And it's really nice to have this group of people here who care about this topic and are interested to come to this talk on a Thursday night. And I'm very grateful to all of you for showing up. So thank you.
Yes, thank you everybody for coming. Okay, so let's move on to the prize giveaway. Simone, or can you tell us a little bit about just a couple of the items and where they came from?
Yeah. Oh gosh, I should have brought them in here, but should I go get them or just tell you about it? Okay, I'll go get them real quick.
If anyone has any other questions for Sim, do drop them in the chat. We might have a couple minutes after the prize giveaway.
So the majority of the artists are local Houston, but although some of them are like just sort of loosely affiliated with the Gulf Coast. But we have really cool pieces like celebrating queerness, like Noah's transness. So like a friend of mine, Lisa, did this. This is Lisa Chow, did this mini painting of the trans flag. And also she threw in like a patch, like an iron-on patch of a rainbow. Rainbows are like one of her things. She's really cool. Check her out, Lisa Chow on Twitter, Lisa Chow Art on Twitter and Instagram. This is Ryan Francisco. She's a Houston photographer. She did this, this is a photo print of somewhere in Houston, but this photo just like really reminded me of the themes of Depart Depart, like coming out from under the shelter and then a sunrise and kind of a chemically colored sky. After all, Houston is called Chemical City.
Even the colors of that print are very much like your book cover.
Yeah. This is one of the most directly like Cli-Fi things is Sarah Welch and her partner are called Mystic Multiples. They own a risograph press. And so this is a book very clearly about climate change on the Gulf Coast, deteriorating coastlines and increased frequency of storms. Sort of a comic book, Galveston specific version of Beasts of the Southern Wild. And a print from that, you're also gonna get a print from that comic of driving the ATV through the floodwaters with the flooded highway overpass in the distance. It was nice while it lasted. I really love this comic series. This is the first issue. I think there's 3 now in holdouts. So those are a few of the pieces. You can see all of the pieces and check out all of the artists in my, probably you've seen them if you're here, because I promoted them all on Instagram, Twitter, and there's stickers, there's all kinds of things. There's more posters. Ooh, I really love the Texas Edibles one. This one's great. This is also a risograph press of Texas Edibles in case you need to be foraging for food at some point in the near future. So yeah, there's just like a ton of great art here from artists that I really love. And if you don't win the prize, but you like some of the art that I've been promoting, please just go get it from them. I mean, all this stuff is really cheap. Like everything was like between $5 and $15. So you can have it even if you don't win the prize.
And the links to the artists, those can be found on your YouTube video.
My YouTube video, my Instagram thread from like 2 days ago. And if you found this event on Facebook, if you found this event on Twitter, I've got threads with all of them there. Should I drop them in the chat too?
If it's convenient.
Yeah, let me just pop all those links and bios in the chat. This is gonna be a big long comment, but here's all the bios of the artists and their links in the chat. Here we go. Oh, it's saying no. Maybe it's too much.
It's too long?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, we can we can put it back up on Twitter, and I believe that the Stelliform blog still has those links
Oh yeah,
up on the latest post. Yeah.
Just this. Can we put a link to the Stelliform blog in the chat?
Yeah. Sure. I'll do that while you give away the first of our prizes. Do you want to do the sticker packs first?
Sure. Okay. So the 5 people who are getting sticker packs of Depart to Part stickers and a copy of the ebook, in case you don't have it already, are Maricela Varela, Jen Cox, Cynthia Zhang, Lawrence Early, and Milena Tolovich.
Congratulations.
Hey, you're getting stickers.
So we'll get information from you on where to send those.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'll be emailing you because I believe I have all of your emails from the event, right? And then the winner of the grand prize. Oh, I see. Okay, so the link to the blog post where you can buy all the art is in the chat. And the winner of the grand prize is Emma Reinhardt. You were selected. Yay.
Yay, congratulations, Emma.
I hope you enjoy all of it.
Yeah, and for those of you that are disappointed, the links are available for you to go look at the beautiful art and maybe buy some for yourself.
Mm-hmm. And follow those artists on Twitter and Instagram because they're all really cool, and the majority of them like do stuff related to climate change. So I think you'll enjoy their work.
Okay, so that takes us to the end of the hour. Thank you so much, Sim, for talking with us today about writing climate change and about your novella Depart to Part. Depart to Part is available at any bookstore. Yeah, you can special order it if they don't have it. And of course, we still do have signed copies for sale on the Stelliform site. So if you go to stelliform.press, you can get yourself a signed copy of Depart to Part. And also, the ones that you get from us are printed on recycled paper. So if that's important to you, you should get your copy of Depart to Part from stelliform.press. So I'll say thank you again, Sam, and thank you to everyone for coming. And that's it for us.
Thank you, Selena.
All right.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Take care.